Good morning, everyone. My name is Alan Carney. Thank you for coming to our presentation. Our group has our BBC group that's Becoming Beloved Community. Wanted to share our trip with you, as well as our thoughts and our feelings about what we saw. So I'd like to start out with a prayer by Martin Luther King. If you would, let us pray. Ever-present God, you called us to be in relationship with one another and promised to dwell wherever two or three are gathered. In our community, we are many different people. We come from many different places, have many different cultures. Open our hearts that we may be bold in finding the riches of inclusion and the treasures of diversity among us. We pray in faith. Amen. So the BBC, Becoming Beloved Community, is an Episcopal ministry working toward racial reconciliation. We are made up of people of different faiths and beliefs. We make a long-term commitment to understand racial history, justice, healing, and reconciliation. We view, study, and discuss books, articles, and videos about racism and anti-racism, and reflect on what it means to be white in this time. In addition, we take pilgrimages to various locations to learn more about history, discrimination, and the conditions that have affected people of color and others who have been mistreated. We're all on a lifelong journey toward God's dream, taking intentional and faithful steps as if moving through the four quadrants of a labyrinth. Those four quadrants are, number one, truth-telling. We tell the truth about the complicity in systems of racial justice and injustice in the past and the present. Proclamation is number two. We publicly share about the history and reality of race and proclaim our dream of a beloved community through prayer, preaching, and conversation. Number three is formation. We are called to cross racial, cultural, and ethnic lines, to examine the structures of oppression and their impact on our own and others' lives, and to grow as ambassadors of reconciliation and healing in the world. And the fourth one is justice. We participate in the repair and restoration of communities and institutions that struggle to flourish because of white dominant systems that our churches and leaders help to bless and build. Our latest pilgrimage during the first part of May took us to Selma and Montgomery, Alabama. As you'll remember, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma was the beginning of a civil rights march known as Bloody Sunday. On March the 7th, 1965, approximately 600 civil rights demonstrators were attacked by police and state troopers on horses with whips, billy clubs, and tear gas while attempting to march to the state capital of Montgomery to protest voting rights. It wasn't until March 21st they were allowed to proceed with their march with the protection of National Guard troops that were ordered by President Lyndon Johnson. 5 days later, 25,000 marchers, led by Dr. Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders, approached the Capitol building in Montgomery in an attempt to deliver a petition to then Governor George Wallace. One of Wallace's secretaries took the petition, and then later Congress passed a voting rights bill later in that year. Our next stop was at a place called the Lowndes Interpretive Center. That center is located midway between Selma and Montgomery on the route of the Civil Rights March. It serves as a repository of information for the unfortunate and significant events that occurred in Lowndes County during the march. The museum houses exhibits on the death of Episcopal Seminarian Jonathan Daniels, the slaying of Viola Louza, a white woman who assisted marchers by transporting them to Selma, and the establishment of Tent City, which housed families dislodged by white landowners in Lowndes County. The center is set up midway between Selma and Montgomery. In Montgomery, we experienced the works of an organization named Equal Justice Initiative. The founder and executive director, Brian Stevenson, is an American lawyer, social justice activist, and law professor. He has challenged bias against the poor and minorities in the criminal justice system, especially where children are concerned. Stevenson initiated the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery. It honors the names of more than 4,400 African Americans lynched in the 12 states of the South, as well as some from the North and West, between the years 1877 and 1950. Victims' names are etched into a total of 805 hanging steel rectangles, each one representing a county within a state. Every entry in the memorial had to be doubly documented in order to be included. This process took over 10 years. Associated with the memorial are plaques honoring those that were lynched after 1950, including Isidore Banks, who was lynched in Marion, Arkansas in June of 1954. Obviously, there were many more lynchings that couldn't meet that criteria, including some in Washington and Benton County, Arkansas. We also visited a related exhibit by EJI. We visited a related exhibit by the Equal Justice Initiative called the Legacy Museum: From Enslavement to Mass Incarceration. It shows a comprehensive history of the destructive violence that shaped our nation, from the slave trade to the era of Jim Crow and racial terror lynchings to our current mass incarceration crisis. Between 1501 and 1867, 13 million African people were kidnapped and brought to the U.S. as slaves. 2 million others died on the way. In the Americas, a caste system based on race and color emerged. That system, along with legal and political systems, codified white supremacy and enshrined slavery as a permanent and hereditary status. That racial hierarchy continues to haunt our nation today. Some of us also visited the EJI's newly opened Freedom Monument Sculpture Park. The park is a 17-acre site on the banks of the Alabama River, which was used to transport slaves from the Gulf of Mexico to Montgomery through Mobile. It uses art and artifacts that provide a unique view into the lives of enslaved people. The artworks, in tandem with historical artifacts, dramatize the brutality of slavery while simultaneously illuminating the strength, dignity, power, and resilience of enslaved people and their descendants. Our group spent the first and the last night at Camp McDowell, an Episcopal retreat center and camp located northwest of Birmingham. Our first night there was brief, but our last night allowed us to eat together and unpack what we had seen, heard, and felt from the previous 2 days. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panel of speakers who want to tell you what they heard, felt, and saw on our journey.
Good morning. My name is David Jolliffe, and I was part of the group that went there. You see me pictured frequently with my wife, who's off doing some sort of volunteer training this morning, so I am speaking for the both of us. Dr. King once referred to these words as what he called the American Creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among those rights are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And Dr. King used to say, America doesn't need to do anything different. It just needs to behave like it says it's supposed to behave. But unfortunately, we've seen over the centuries that thing that has become the creed has been called into question a great many times and continues to be doing so today, as Alan pointed out. One of the things that I found most striking, that Gwen and I talked a good bit about afterwards, was the continued incidence of voter suppression in the United States. Really, not even stopping to this day, more about that in a minute, but certainly in the wake of Reconstruction, when suddenly people who had not been given the permission to vote anymore were given the permission to vote, and suddenly that population became a kind of a power center. Lots of folks got sort of antsy about that and said, what can we do to make sure that all of those people aren't going to vote in some way that we don't want them to vote? So even in the wake of all of the legislation that would purport to be promote equality, many states developed voter suppression tests, voter literacy tests. And I give you an example of one. I left a couple at every table. I've got a few extras if any of you would like to take it home and take the test. But here are, by the way, this I'm not going to name the state where this is in progress, but this test, which comes directly from the Legacy Museum in Birmingham, this test was being used through 1965. So if you want to know where does this exist in your own lifetime, that's where it is. And there are any number of questions on there that are going to be questions that people are going to say, I literally cannot vote. My favorite, and Gwen's as well, is to say, how many jelly beans are there in this jar? May I show a show of hands, please? Do you have a count? And if you have a count you want to share with you don't. But you can see that there are other questions that are equally confounding, and certainly how would anyone know how to answer them? How many windows can be counted in the White House? What does a writ of certiorari, a writ of era coa nobis, and subpoena dulces tecum mean? May I have volunteers and anyone in the room? And you can go down through the list as well. You know, you get some that are a little more unusual than others. But you take a look, for example, of, in the very last one, in what year did Congress gain the right to prohibit the migration of persons to the state? So these are questions that you would have to answer if you could not show proof that you had a fifth grade education. If you could show proof you had a fifth grade education, you did not need to take this test. But as you might guess, there was a substantial population that did not have a fifth grade education and could not pass this test and therefore couldn't vote. Again, is this something that's simply an artifact of the past? It is not. If you take a look at what folks are doing now with gerrymandering, fixing boundaries of districts to disenfranchise certain populations whom they do not want to give power to, you can certainly see it in such regulations as you're not permitted to vote by mail, or maybe you are permitted to vote by mail. You may have an absentee ballot, or you may not have an absentee ballot. My favorite is that the law I think did not pass, but you were not permitted to give water to people standing in line to vote, because that was to be seen as favoring one candidate or the other. So this is and Alan pointed this out directly, that a great deal of what we learned on our trip to Alabama demonstrated ideologies, principles, thoughts that are still very much with us to this day, and we can still see people who are very antsy about allowing people to vote whom they don't think will vote in their favor. I will leave this here for you to ponder. I'll pick it up after church. So if any of you want to get busy counting, well, I go. And forgive me for slipping out. My old advisor, Jim Canavy, used to say that the saints have the power of bilocation, but we poor mortals don't. We can only be in one place at a time. So I need to go be in the choir here in about 5 minutes. So great to have you all here this morning, and I'm going to turn it over to Patty.
Well, I'm Margaret Ann Gilmore. Like this? Way close? Okay. I'm Margaret Ann Gilmore. And I remember when we started on this pilgrimage, Sarah Milford asked us, why are you going on this pilgrimage? And there were the obvious things that came to my mind, things like, well, I can get to know people better, I'll learn their stories and what they're doing, but that wasn't it. And I'd never been to Alabama, so I was curious about what that looked like, and the museum. I love museums, but that wasn't really it either. So I discovered it afterwards. When we went to the museum, which was very powerful, it was one of the best designed museums I've ever seen. When we came in, they recognized that this is powerful. They offered places for people to take a break and other people to come and sit with them if they needed that. So you go in and you leave differently. It was very powerful. So the first exhibit I went through, it was divided the same, basically, exhibit on one side as the other. And that enabled people to move in because there could be a group going on one side and then one on the other. And it was a slave ship, and there were figures, life-size people, that were modeled out of clay. And I didn't expect to see mothers nursing in chains or young children in that slave ship. And each face had a different expression of anguish and fear. And then right beside that exhibit, there was this huge video of the Atlantic Ocean, the waves that came crashing down. And this is where people were being sent out on this ocean. Most of the Africans had never seen the ocean. So what a fierce thing that must have been. And there were little rooms you could go to and sit, and they would explain more about the exhibit. And in that exhibit, those figures were carved by a young African-American, young, 20, 30, that went to Africa to listen to the stories of the elders that shared the stories passed down through generations of what had happened. And he harvested clay from the area, a white-gray kind of clay, and formed these figures. And if you do Google Legacy Museum, you can see some of those figures that were made. So I'm not going to go through all the exhibits or even any more of them, but it went through the stages of the transatlantic ships and slavery and Reconstruction and the struggle for civil rights and incarceration, which we are still there. That's what amazed me. We're still there. At the end was an art museum of paintings and exhibits of African American artists. And I thought that was a nice way to help with the rawness of this. It's not a place you go to see exhibits. You go through an experience in this museum. And then that evening when we sat down to process, a friend of mine said that he had come there to bear witness. And I thought, yes, that's why I'm here. I'm here to bear witness, to honor these people that have gone through this, and to offer prayers.
Good morning. My name is Lisa Phillips, and I bring you greetings from St. John's in Harrison, where I worship, and to thank the becoming beloved community for opening your pilgrimage to folks like me and around the state. Being with you, of course, the experience was transformative, but especially being with you, fellow Episcopalians, was transformative as well, and I count you as lifelong friends now. So thank you so much. I want to talk a little bit about my why too, so thank you, Margaret Ann, for setting that up. Of course, I grew up in the 60s, as many of us did, and I'm a child of generations of racists, stretching back to probably Tennessee and maybe farther. And so as a young girl, I was exposed to racism early. My grandpa and my dad owned a motel, and we lived in an apartment above the motel, and the office was downstairs, and I would often, especially in the summertime, bounce around the office as a little girl, pestering my dad and sisters and mom. And I remember the first experience of racism that I saw was when a very infrequent occurrence when a black family or a black salesman would come through town and need a place to stay. And that, of course, was before the internet, and you just went up to a motel that you saw on the road and you asked for a room. We had 33 rooms in our motel, which is still there. It's now turned into an apartment complex in Harrison. By the way, did I say I'm a lifelong resident of Harrison, except for my time at the university? And so the rooms back then, a double room was $13. So I remember, as I said, people of color coming into the office asking for a room, and my dad would say one of two things. He would either say, no, we don't have any available, and I knew that was a lie. Or he'd say, yes, we do have rooms available, it's $200. And so you can imagine the people of color would walk out, and my dad was so proud, and I was so angry. And as I grew, I watched television, and I don't remember seeing Bloody Sunday on television, but I do remember a lot of other scenes of civil rights struggles, and of course Martin Luther King's assassination. And so from a very early age, I was an activist, but I was a quiet one because you did not argue with your dad. And then as I grew, I learned Harrison's reputation as a sundown town and as a place for two significant riots in the early 20th century. So when I was convinced and committed to breaking the generational curse of racism in my family and to do what I could to spread racial healing and justice as much as one person can in the broader community. So again, when I heard about the pilgrimage, I knew I had to go. So I want to talk a little bit about Bloody Sunday. Thank you, Alan, for setting this up as well. The very first stop we made was at the Selma Bridge, and when we got off the bus, let me back up. Our stories are important. It's important to hear the stories of those that went through the struggle and the descendants of those who went through the struggle. And it's important for us to tell those stories over and over again. And you're here because you want to do that. I think that's wonderful. So, Bloody Sunday, of course, lots of people in America were watching the television, and I believe it was ABC was presenting the Judgment at Nuremberg movie, which I just watched for the first time, and it's of the trial of the Nazis in Germany. And my family was not watching that, by the way. Surprise. Anyhow, millions of Americans were, and that's when the news broke in and said and showed what was happening on the Selma Bridge, on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. The beatings and the oppression of the Alabama state troopers against the black and white folks who wanted to walk to Montgomery and were met with violence on the bridge. And Martin Luther King put out a call to America and said, come from every place that's within my voice, come to Selma, we're going to try again, and you can partner with us. Well, as Alan mentioned, there was a woman in Detroit who was watching television that night. Her name was Viola Liuzzo, 39-year-old mother of 5, and she was an activist of sorts. And she said, I've got to go. So her husband said, yes, go, because he knew he couldn't stop her. Her children were a little bit nervous. They said, you're going to get killed. She said, I still have to go. So now fast forward to May, and we're stepping off the tour bus, and we're at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there's a young black man standing there selling T-shirts and telling his story. And remind me, because I walked up a little bit late, and I think he was the great nephew of the man I'm going to talk about, or was he the grandson? He was a descendant of the man I'm about to tell you about. So Viola Liuzzo drove from Detroit to Selma to help in any way that she could. She was a nurse, and so she could help with health needs, and they needed people to drive to Montgomery to wait for the marchers the next time they went or tried to go to Montgomery, and they were, of course, successful that day. And so she was one of those that would bring back the marchers to Selma in her car. And that night, she had, the stories is very confusing, and there are different iterations of the story, so I'm going to tell you what I've heard, and you can research yourself, but there are 2 or 3 different versions of this story. There was a black man she was driving, and there was a black man in the passenger seat. And as they approached Selma, they stopped at a stoplight, and this group of Klansmen stopped beside them and saw the 2 of them in the car. The light turned green, and they proceeded, and the Klansmen rushed ahead to them to meet them and shot and killed Viola. And the black man, who was the uncle or grandfather of this young man telling the story, survived. And it made me think, as a little girl when that happened, what would I have done if I'd heard Martin Luther King's call? I knew what I wanted to do back then, but I was just a little girl and could only do what little girls do. But now I'm a woman, and I know better, and I can do better. And so I'm just so grateful to be able to tell stories like that and to share in this community and my community and as many communities as I can the story of their struggle. So let me wrap this up. By the way, the man's name was Leroy. So I ask you, what can you do? What can we do together? And thank you very much.
Excuse me. Can you hear me? Okay, I'm Patty Williams, and I have been a member of BBC since it started. So, you've heard a lot. I'd like you to just take a moment and see how you're feeling. So just close your eyes as you hear this. I need to do that for me after hearing all that. So, how many of you gone on a journey and you got more than you bargained for? You know, and you came back and somehow you knew you were changed in your heart, in your mind, in your soul. So that's what happened on this journey. What I'd like to do is kind of help you experience along with us. So just imagine you're at the bridge back then. And imagine, if you could, that you're a fellow traveler and you're going to go across that bridge. Now you can choose, are you white or are you black? So just see if you can picture that. There you are. What do you see in front of you? What were they called? What did they have? Guns? So, how are you going to go? How do you feel as you're trying to decide, how am I going to go? That's pretty powerful, isn't it? Okay, so that's a touch of Selma. Now, I'm going to ask you to take a deep breath. And now let's go to the Legacy Museum. And you're walking up the steps, and all of a sudden you see this huge ocean. I mean, it's huge. It's as big as that, right? Okay, there it is. Right away, you're caught up in a journey that can take a day or 2 days or whatever. So now, imagine you're on the ship. Ooh, what's that like? Do you have room? Do you have a baby? Yeah. What's that like? And along the way, somebody dies right next to you. And they throw the body over into the ocean. It's kind of painful, right? That's what I felt. Pain, grief. So, right away, that grief starts, that sorrow. Sorrow deeper, 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 deeper than words can be, I would say. Wouldn't you, Jim, Susie, all of us? And even as you all are here hearing that, there's grief, there's sorrow, there may be anger. So let's take a deep breath together. And as I'm not going to go through the whole thing, but one thing that stays with me even now is you walk through and there are cells. They're like cages for one person. And I think there's about 4 or 5 of those. And they're women, as I remember. And one of them is a woman in her cell, moaning, moaning, and then singing. That one stays with me. Even now, I can feel that and hear that. So just imagine you're hearing that moaning. It could be like you're moaning if you were in the cell or if you're hearing it. So I'll just have a couple more. Go into the lynching exhibit. I mean, it's huge. And there are jars there that descendants of people who have been lynched have gathered the soil and put it, I can't remember how many there were, I mean, a whole bunch. So there's that way of, excuse me, honoring your ancestors. But let me tell you, there is a man who has written a book, and he asked you if you wanted to, and I couldn't do it, and I'm not sure I could still. Imagine you are one of the lynchers. Can you imagine what that would be like? Some of the people in the crowd are kids up at the front watching the lynching. So you can imagine being a lyncher in the mob, being lynched, being a spectator. Yeah. You know, those are real happenings in our world. And I will tell you, there was a 10-year-old boy who was lynched with his father. And if I'm not mistaken, I know I'm not, a 3 to 6 month old infant was lynched. And I can feel the silence. Horrible. That's in our history. So that's what the pilgrimage did for me, is make all that so much more real, so that when we got now, in conclusion, we get to Camp McDowell, and Sarah is leading us in a circle, so that if we could do it here, you could talk about how you're feeling. So everybody, was able to. And I will tell you that when it got to me, I had no words. That is how deep the grief was and the sorrow for me, and still lingers. So I asked Sarah, what do I do with this? Sit with it, Patty. Sit with it. So I did. And the next morning at the chapel, we had a chance to receive blessing from on high. And that is what helps me continue to do the work, to hang in there, and to own that I have been complicit in racism, as all of us have. And in BBC now, what we are doing is talking about our internal racism, which is a whole nother thing. But thank you all for being here.
I'd like to add my own testimony. Thank you, David. You've heard about the museums, and I can tell you when I was walking through the Legacy Museum, because it is truly a documented history of slavery and incarceration. I had this feeling of great shame and guilt of being a member of a race who had mistreated people for so long and with such tragedy. And I had to keep telling myself to acknowledge the feeling, but don't get wrapped up in it. Because I needed to be able to move forward with trying to correct any of the injustices that still exist, which there are many. So I felt the pain for myself. I felt the pain for other individuals. But I know that I can't be wrapped up in that guilt and that shame because I need to be able to move forward. The other thing I want to relay is when we were at the Peace and Justice Memorial, all of those rectangles that you've seen, they're all at the same height. And so as you're walking through these, seeing them kind of face to face, eventually you get to a place where you start to go downhill. The rectangles, the steel rectangles are still at the same height. So as you move down that walkway, you are looking up, and you get lower and lower, and the memorials are at the same height. And about 3/4 of the way through, it dawned on me as I was trying to read the names of the counties and the states and the individuals that my head was in the same position as a lynched person, that up and back. And I had this really cold shiver of that reality. I'm reminded of a saying someone said, discrimination, what happened in the past, it's not anything I did. And I feel the same way. I didn't do it. But I do feel the responsibility to do something about it now. And so I have to sit with that and try to figure out what it is for me to do to take up this cause. If you think about abuse, like a father abuses their wife or their child, and how that abuse cycle can continue from one generation to the next. Can you imagine the hurt that was involved with slavery being passed down from one generation to the next? And I think that that's what, when you ask yourself, how can I get in touch with what's going on in the world today? I had to ask myself, okay, well, how do I know what's going on in the world today? Well, I interact with people. I talk to my friends. I watch the news. And so I ask myself, how many people of color do I have as friends? Not acquaintances, friends. And the only way for me to understand how they can live in this world with still so much hate is start to befriend people. And you can do that by starting to visit black-owned businesses or just reach out to people in volunteer organizations, food bank. When I was, after I finished going through the Peace and Justice Memorial, there's another bank of marble markers that are there to show the people who had been lynched after 1950. And one of those is a woman in Marion, Arkansas, that was lynched in 1954. So not that long ago. a black gentleman was standing there looking, and we started talking. And he said, you know, why can't people just help each other? He said, I saw a bird helping another bird build a nest. Why can't we do that? It's like we don't even have a bird brain. And he started chuckling. So then we talked a little bit more about hate in the world and how when children are born, they don't have hate. That is taught to them. Hate is taught. Anyway, we talked a little bit more. And when he was ready to leave, I shook his hand. We shook hands. And, he said, it was nice to meet you. And I said, you too. So that leads us to what others have said. What is ours to do about this? And it takes effort. We have been taught discrimination in our lives. We have grown up with it in our political systems, our social systems, and we have to be more aware of when we see it, and then do something about it. We talked about our time at Camp McDowell, and that was so valuable to be able to sit around, talk with each other, hear everyone's different perspectives on what they had seen and what they had felt. You've heard a good sample of that today, and I'd like to end with a short video that features the director of the Equal Justice Initiative talking about his work.
It's important that we begin to commit to an era of truth and justice, that we tell the truth about our history, that we find the words necessary to understand all of the pain, all of the suffering that was created by 400 years of enslavement, lynching, segregation, and injustice. It begins in Africa, where millions of people were kidnapped, abducted, taken from their homes, taken from their families, chained, forced onto ships where they were displaced forever. Without understanding that legacy, we don't appreciate the harm, the damage, the tragedy that surrounded the founding of this country. We still live in a country where there is this problem of racial inequality, racial injustice, and the narrative that created that problem of racial difference continues to haunt us today. And so this museum is dedicated to helping people understand the journey. We want people to understand the suffering that slavery created. The demographic geography of America was shaped largely by racial terror. A landscape, a legal architecture that codified racial hierarchy continued to shape life in this country. This society, this country, this nation has work to do to fully overcome the history and legacy of slavery. At the Legacy Museum, we believe an important experience awaits each and every person, that there is a journey that must be taken to create a different kind of future. It is hard to confront these painful truths, But the powerful thing is that when we have the courage to learn the truth, we open up doors that permit justice, that permit reckoning, that permit healing. This museum is dedicated to creating a society where the children of our children are no longer burdened by the legacy of slavery, no longer presumed dangerous and guilty, no longer haunted by racial inequality no matter where they go. But to get to that society, we all have a role to play. And that's why we want you to come to Montgomery and not just see the sights, but to hear the sounds, to experience the spirit of the people who lived here, who have fought here, who have worked here, and to take that spirit with you out into the world where you can do the same. You can continue to find ways to advance justice in your society, your community, your neighborhood.
So, if you're interested, if you have any questions, we're running out of time. Write your questions on the cards that are on the table. But if you're interested in maybe join us at Becoming Beloved Community, joining our group, the BBC, if you would put your email on the card, then we will put you on our mailing list. We meet twice a month here at St. Paul's, and we don't have another pilgrimage planned, but the ideas are starting to come together. So, thank you very much.